And so could the plot have succeeded? Well, no. Most English people at this time were Protestants and were pro-monarchy. Had they succeeded in blowing up the House of Parliament, then England actually might have become even more Protestant, more puritanical, and may have also seen the rise of an absolute monarchy in this country, as occurred in Sweden and Prussia. Now, Charles I would have become king at the age of 4, instead of 24 as he did historically. There'd have been none of the slow parliamentary reforms of the reign of James I. And Charles I, remember, was an autocrat. James I, however, his father, had steadily handed power over to Parliament. The Catholics of England may well have ended up being slaughtered by paranoid and vengeful Protestants. This had occurred, after all, to the Protestants in France. They had been slaughtered by vengeful and paranoid Catholics at roughly the same time period. And so the Protestants in England might well have gone out hunting Catholics in revenge for the terrorist atrocities. And Charles I would probably have grown up to be very different. As it was, Charles I grew up hating his father. Charles I really wanted to be an absolute monarch, and he was convinced that his father, James I, had been handing over his birthright to Parliament. Instead, however, instead of hating his father, he may well have cherished his memory and and of course his father wouldn't have lived long enough to put through those democratic reforms, and he would have become pro-Puritan rather than pro-Catholic. Charles I had become pro-Catholic in defiance of his own father. He might, however, instead have become rather more pro-Puritan because the Catholics would have killed his father. He would have had considerable support for this from the country. The problem Charles I had when he was trying to be an absolute monarch was not that the country didn't want an absolute monarch. They didn't want one that was suspiciously pro-Catholic. Most of the problems of Charles I's reign that led to the English Civil War and the victory of Parliament was that he was too friendly to the Catholics. When the Catholics had killed his father, at such a young age, he would not have grown up to be friendly to the Catholics. And so the country would have been right behind this idea of a hardline Protestant, puritanical, absolute monarchy. And so his pro-Catholic stance 20 years later would prove to be highly unpopular. Now, instead, England would probably have entered into the wars of religion on the continent wholeheartedly. As it was, England only half-heartedly got involved in the wars of religion between Catholic and Protestant, because England was a Protestant country ruled by Charles I, who was fairly pro-Catholic for the time. This wouldn't have been the case. He'd have hated the Catholics, and so he would have thrown England wholeheartedly into the wars of religion, which the English people would have been definitely behind. And so the consequence of the Gunpowder Plot succeeding, or rather succeeded in blowing up the House of Parliament, would not have been a Catholic England. No, but there would have probably been no English Civil War. There would have been a slaughter of Catholics. And there may have been, centuries later, an English Revolution to remove the monarchy completely, but certainly not in the 1600s. We'd have first of all had an absolute Protestant monarchy in the 1600s and into the 1700s. An English Revolution, if it came, would have come much like the French Revolution came, to sweep away an absolute monarchy in France. But was this plot a government conspiracy? Well, Robert Cecil, the Chief Minister, would certainly have known about these kind of conspiracies. After all, his own father had been involved in a plot known as the Babington Plot, where Walsingham and his father William Cecil had set up Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots had been forced out of Scotland as she was a disastrous queen. She was held prisoner in England, but Elizabeth I wouldn't execute her cousin, and she had to die. She'd been involved in many plots to kill Elizabeth herself. And so Walsingham, that dark knight of English espionage, and William Cecil had entrapped Mary Queen of Scots by finding a convenient tool, a convenient Catholic known as Babington, and getting Babington to plot the death of Elizabeth I and invite Mary Queen of Scots to take part in the plot, which she had, in codes. And the coded letters were smuggled into see her in the corks of beer barrels. And when Babington was arrested, she was taken to trial, and she said, "No, you got no evidence." Walsingham showed the codes. She said, "Could be anything." He said, "On the contrary, I can crack this code because I wrote this code, and we know that you're involved." and so Mary Queen of Scots got executed. And so just as William Cecil and Walsingham had set up a government conspiracy to trap Catholics, Robert Cecil might have set up a government conspiracy to trap Catholics. What are our suspicions for this? Well, firstly, the cellar had been rented to Thomas Percy by John Wynyard, a member of the government. Now, he was aged 46 and was a close friend of Robert Cecil. Now, he unexpectedly died suddenly on the 5th of November. There is some suspicion that John Wynyard was told to rent this undercroft to the plotters to help them out in their plot, and then was murdered on the 5th of November so that he couldn't say, "No, wait a minute, you told me to lend this out to the plotters." Normally, unexpected deaths get investigated in this time period. There are autopsies normally, but for some strange reason, and despite the fact that he was a member of the government and only 46 and had been in good health, there was no investigation into the death. Now, all supplies of gunpowder in the country were kept under guard at the Tower of London, and we have excellent records for the gunpowder stores to the Tower of London. You can check up any year and you'll find the records, except for, strangely, 1604, where the page has gone missing. It's the only year that we're missing, and so it could well be the government gave the gunpowder to the plotters. Also remember, Lord Monteagle showed Cecil the note on the 27th of October warning about the plot, but the cellars were not searched for a week, possibly because they knew the gunpowder couldn't explode. The gunpowder itself, the barrels appear to have been a top layer of gunpowder, and then the rest of the barrels wouldn't have exploded. So the gunpowder could not have worked. The gunpowder was actually was safe. It was not a mixture that exploded. The top layer was to fool the experienced soldier Guido Fawkes. He'd open the barrel, check the top layer. It was good gunpowder. The rest of the barrels, we don't think were. Now, Holbeck House, where the plotters went to after the failure of the plot, was surrounded on the 7th of November, which is odd because the government's own story is that they didn't know the identity of the plotters till the week after. And so, before the government officially knew who the plotters were, they'd already surrounded where the plotters lived with soldiers. Remember, the plotters were meant to have started by digging a tunnel under the House of Parliament. No evidence has ever been found of the tunnel that they were supposed to have started digging. Also, Francis Tresham had met with Cecil personally before the 5th of November, but Cecil publicly denied ever meeting Francis Tresham, and Tresham was probably poisoned after the plot. And we have here the words of a admittedly Catholic Italian visitor in 1605. Some hold it as certain that there had been foul play, and that some of the government secretly spun a web to entangle these poor gentlemen. You might ask, why would the government possibly have set up the Gunpowder Plot? James I was initially unpopular. After he was saved by this miracle, he became very, very popular. The government was broke, but after the miracle of deliverance, the Parliament, remember, voted that second biggest taxation in a century to bail out government finances as a vote of thanks for the government being saved. And so the government gained money and popularity, and Robert Cecil managed to find a way to convince James I to start clamping down on Catholics. And so we have political, religious and financial reasons that the government might have set this up. It certainly was very convenient for them, and it's still remembered by celebrations, of course, every year. If you do go to, I love fireworks, just aside, when you have a bonfire and you put a model or a guy, because the word guy is the Old English word for model, on the bonfire, you're not burning Guido Fawkes, you're burning a model of the Pope. For the government said that on the anniversary of the foiling of the plot, the English would burn models of the Pope on their bonfires to show their defiance of Catholic Europe. But an interesting plot, certainly, but also most likely a government conspiracy. Thank you very much.